Alrighty, in this video we are going to continue working on getting our game servers to actually, well, simulate a game. So the first thing I want to do is I want to get our Unity project to build. It looks like some of the changes we made in the previous video broke our Unity build. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to open up our project. And with that open, let's go ahead and figure out what this is all about. So there's no argument given that corresponds to the required formal parameter transport. So what does that mean? That means that we are missing one of the parameters that we added to the system's event reader. So we need the serializer, the client systems, and the iClient transport. So if you recall, in the system's event reader, over here, what am I doing? Control T, systems event reader. We were using the transport in the case of receiving getting sent a message from the server to a client and then having the client return with a response. So let's go ahead and do that. So we need a transport, which fortunately our transport here is provided as a constructor parameter. So we can just fill in that parameter with, or that argument with that parameter. And that should be awesome. So let's come back into Unity and let's hit play. And it looks like, I think everything built, because usually a compiler error would. All right, awesome. So before we move on, I kind of want to test something real fast. So I want to come over here into our, wherever you ran off to, over here. And I want to jump into our base components, and I want to test to see if we can indeed send results back from the client. So how about on this login system server, we have iLogin system client, debug, set players available. Let's go ahead and do a deferred of string. I want to see if this works. I'm not sure if it will. So let's go ahead and, in addition to that, jump into where we implemented that systems. We won't need this yet, but I'm just curious. So on our awake, we debug set players available, and then at the end of that, I'm going to say var def equals, because I'm running out of horizontal screen space here, def dot on success, def goes into, and then I'm simply going to say log info got, oops, let's just call this res. Got res dot result from client. I'm just curious if this is going to work. So let's go ahead and hit F6. And this will make a client break, but again, we're doing science here, so that stuff will happen. I'll pause while this builds. And we got a couple errors. iLogin system, for some reason, we have the client console, which, you know, I could probably just delete that. This entire client console so far, because we just used it for testing earlier. So with that out of the way, whenever you do that, whenever you change like a systems or whatever, always be sure to jump into Unity first and then jump into Visual Studio. Give focus the Unity window, because the Unity window is not going to update assemblies until it receives focus. And we need that in order to jump back into Visual Studio and see the compiler error, which our compiler error is obviously going to be that we're not implementing that that method properly, the debug set available players. Also, a lot of things seem to have freaked out, which if this ever happens to you, I'll show you guys in a second how we would go about fixing that, but I think it's just my version of Visual Studio and ReSharper throwing a fit. So with that out of the way, I think all these errors that we're seeing are from Visual Studio itself, and if not, we will we'll resolve that. So I should have, in theory, resolved all the errors. And I did, so everything's awesome. Okay, so it says choose a user to log in as. I do have the server running. There we go. And check that out. It actually works. Hey there, from client. So we now have bidirectional communication from the server to the client. I'm not sure if I'm going to ever use that. Like I said in the last video, I would be concerned of opening up the potential for denial of service attack, where the client performs a bunch of these operations that result in the server sending a bunch of requests to the client waiting for a response, but if you didn't send those responses, the server will just be accumulating all of those potential responses and eventually potentially run out of memory. So let's go ahead and undo that change. So again, we just nuke that, and we're just going to return void. I just really wanted to see that because I think that is an interesting potential use case in the future if we ever decide to take advantage of it. So, blah, 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 and then finally we'll change it from that. Okay, so everything's building, hopefully. If I hit F6, everything should work. Hopefully. These builds are starting to get kind of long. So now what we're going to do is we are going to start on the ability for the master server to get a reference to all the game servers. And I don't know if we're doing that yet. So if I jump into the region server context, so remember the region server context is the object that is responsible for connecting to the region server. Right now we're not, every time that this connects, I believe it's just kind of sitting there as a peer, right? As one of these peer objects, and it's not notifying anything that there is a new region server available. So we're going to need a list of all the region servers or all the game servers available somewhere so that when a client tries to begin a game, the master server knows which servers it can work with. So let's go ahead and create a new class. We'll create a class that will be responsible for doing that. I think what I'm going to call it is how about region server queue. And the region server queue is all about getting a keeping a list of all of the game servers that are currently available. So so yeah. All right, what I'm going to do is we do have remember our region servers are identified by a GUID, I believe, right? If we go to like game1.debug, it should have this unique ID. So what I'm going to do here, I think in the region server queue, is I'm going to create a private read-only dictionary, just the data structure I'll use for that, GUID, and then comma region server context, and we'll call these, how about just servers? And let's also bring a log. Before I forget, ilog, yeah, log equals log manager, get logger, type of. I should really, I used to have this really cool resharper template that would write all of this out for you, but I lost it somewhere. Anyway, another thing we have to deal with is concurrency, and what I'm thinking here, actually, maybe we won't use a dictionary. Maybe we'll use a concurrent dictionary. So we have two options, kind of. We can, let's think. Yeah, we can either use a fiber or concurrent dictionary. I really haven't played around with the concurrent, because we're going to have operations that are going to be coming in here from different threads. We'll particularly have issues where, let's say we have 20 million game servers, right? And what we do is we launch all of them at once. They'll all be registering against this dictionary simultaneously. So concurrency is a big deal. Obviously, we could use locking. We could use a fiber. But I kind of want to see the concurrent dictionary. Because, again, I haven't really played with this guy much. So concurrent dictionary is one of the concurrent types, I believe, introduced in .NET 4. We have concurrent dictionary, concurrent bag, concurrent exclusive schedule pair. I don't know what that is. Concurrent queue and concurrent stack. So we'll try the concurrent dictionary. So then we'll say servers equals new concurrent dictionary of GUID and region server context. All right. So now we need a way to register and unregister servers from the queue, from the server context. So when the server context gets created, when the region server context gets created, it will add itself to the region server queue. When it gets disposed of, it'll remove it. So we need two public methods here. So we'll say public void register, let's just do register server, the region's implied, region server context, which brings up an interesting thing. How do we get the ID? Oh, that actually, completely forgot about that. So that's an interesting problem. We need to get the ID. Remember the ID from the configuration, but right now the region server only knows about the, is the only thing that knows about the ID because it's in each one of its particular configuration files. So we need a way for the region server, when it connects to the master server, for the region server to register itself by sending both its, by sending basically most of what's in config.json. It needs to send its name, its UDP connection, and its unique ID straight to the server. So what we're going to do is try to do that with our system. So we already have this this game instance system. I don't know if let's think about a name. Naming things is hard, if I want to keep that name or not. And remember, this system is created the moment a connection is established between the server and the master. So in our awake method, we can invoke a method on the proxy that'll tell the master server all about us. So game instance system. We can keep using that, and maybe as we get more functionality in, we might break out different responsibilities for different systems. But let's just leave this so we don't have to rename a bunch of things, because I know you guys hate it when I do that. So let's hop into our interface. So remember, these are the interfaces under BuzzMMO server, components, game instances. And first of all, nuke these 2 test guys. We don't need them anymore. And for the game iGame Instance Master, we need... let's do a deferred of register server. And this is going to take the information that we need. So we do have... in BuzzMMO server, we should have the config, or one of the config objects, game server config. So this will take in a game server config. Remember, the game server config has the name, the UDP connection, and the unique ID. And let's also do a avoid unregister server, so that game servers themselves can unregister from the master server. And I think that'll be it for that. So now we can jump in. Let's do the implementation on the region server first. So go into systems.master, game blah, blah, blah. We can nuke all of this code that we no longer need. And we don't need to implement any members, because right now there's nothing that the master server can tell the region server. But there will be in the future. The master server is going to tell the region server, you know, start a game and give me a game ID or whatever. So... for awake, what we're going to do is we're going to do proxy.register game server, and we need the config. Now, getting the config is very easy because we already have the config on the game server context, if you recall, and we know that the game server context, it has registered itself as a singleton in our container. So in the constructor of our game instance server, in the constructor right here, I can just request a game server context, and we'll just call this server. I can just request that right here, and AutoFact, our IOC container, will take care of satisfying that parameter. So with access to that, we can now do register server.config and pass that in. And I didn't like that. What? Oh yeah, config.gameserver. All right, and then we can do some messages here. I can say, I'm just gonna say on always def goes into, and then I'll say log info. Actually, no, I'm going to do an on fail and on success. So let's do on success, and we'll say, we don't need a multi-line lambda for that. Log info format, info registered to game server. And if there was an error on fail, we'll say def goes into log error could not register game server, colon, followed by, oop, this needs to be a template string, doesn't it? So let's add money in front of that. And then we'll do def.error. So, there. Really straightforward. Again, with this systems implementation, all we gotta do is add a member to an interface, and we have bidirectional communication. All this stuff will be handled by our infrastructure. So, no need to add operation codes or event codes or op customs or anything like that. It's all right here. So that's all the game server needs to do to the master server, but now we have to do the other side to that. So let's go into the master server, into the systems.region and game instance system. So this is sort of the other side to this. The first thing we can do, of course, is remove all 3 of these methods. We don't need the awake method, and obviously we don't need the ping or def test methods, because those were for testing. And now I'm going to come up here and hit alt enter. And that'll go ahead and bring in method stubs for our 2 methods. I am going to move dispose down to the bottom, though. I always like dispose at the bottom. And the game instance system is going to have to get a reference to our game server queue so we can register with it. So we'll do game server queue, and then server queue, alias that out into a field, pop it down there. So I like my, this should be private static read only. Because, you know, the logging is all thread safe. We only need 1 instance. So for register server, what we can do here is we can say server queue dot, and then we'll do the registration now that we have the game server config, which we don't have that method yet. So, wait a sec, I thought I stubbed that in. Or did I stub it in and then delete it? Wait. Where's my dictionary? My concurrent dictionary. Did I delete all of that stuff? Oh no, this is the game server queue, not the region server queue. I need to getting the region and games mixed up. We've used region all the way around this, so I'm gonna delete this empty game server queue object. We don't, or class, we don't need it. I think that will cause some errors because I think we did register it in our master server context, but we'll deal with that in a moment. Let's go ahead and change the type here to region server queue. And now for our register server, we can now do register server region server thing, you know what I'm saying? And then we'll return deferred.success. So of course, if there's an exception at any point, that wants a region server context as well. So the region server context is going to be context followed by config. So, actually, do I want to send in the context or do I want to send in the system, the actual game instance system? Because, yeah, I think I want to pass in the game system. Because we can always get from the game instance system to the context. Of course, we can do it the other way around, but it's not as performant because it has to do a dictionary lookup. So I think I'm going to, when we register the server, we're going to be passing in the instance of the system itself, which will give us access to the proxy, which will give us access to, you know, sending it requests and all that fun stuff. Now, of course, there's an error here because the signature isn't complete. But anyway, if this throws an exception at any point, of course, it'll return a failure back to the region server. So that's really cool. So let's hop open into our region server. And let's fix our... Actually, no, I don't want to pass in config. You know what I want to do with config? I want... No, I do want to pass in config. What I'm going to do is, for the register server, what we're going to do is we're gonna add it to our server's dictionary, but we're also going to pass back to the region server context and add the config to as a property onto this. I think that would be the best way to go about it. So so yeah, we are taking in the config. So we need a game server config, and what we're going to do here is we're going to simply say servers.add. So this is going to be we have a couple options here. I have played with this class before, but not a whole lot. So we have add or update, which is a add it, but if there was a conflict, if there was a concurrency conflict, then update it. And we also have triad, which triad is what we're going to be wanting to do, because we should only ever get one request to register a server for any particular GUID. If we get multiple requests to register the same server with the same GUID, that means there's a bug somewhere, and I think in that case I'm going to throw an exception. So triad takes in a GUID and a value, and the GUID is going to be config.uniqueID, and the value is going to be context, but it returns a Boolean. So I'm going to say if not... log error could not, let's do a template string, could not add server config.name GUID config.uniqueID already taken, and then I'll throw a new invalid operation exception, which I think is just going to be, no, let's throw an RPC exception. Remember, the RPC exceptions will get the error message will get propagated back to the server, whereas invalid operation wouldn't. I'm going to alias out this this string here. I'm going to refactor it into a variable and call this error, because I'm going to use this error both on the log and on throwing that RPC exception. Okay, so now that we have that, now at this point it's added, at this line, it's added to our servers. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, oops, we don't want a region server context. We want to change that type to our game instance system. So game instance system, which of course we have to import that that namespace. And it's just a matter of changing the type. So we'll change the type there, and there, and we're done. Okay. So with that, and we won't call this context, we'll call this system. So with that, we can now notify the context that we've registered itself, and we can pass in the config. So I'll say register server with config, and that'll be it. So obviously the register server method doesn't exist yet, but we can certainly do that. Do we? Okay, so we don't currently. We don't currently log anything out when a game server gets queued, or a region server gets registered. So I'm going to do that here. I'm going to say log.info, and we'll say server config.name with ID config.unique ID at config.udp connection has been registered. All right, so now we can implement this region register server method on our region server context. So I'm just going to hit Alt-Enter and hit Enter. And all that's going to do is it's going to pop down to our region server context and add this register server method. Now, the logic I'm going to do here, I want to expose our config, our game server config, whoops, caps lock, config with a get and a private set. What I'm going to do here inside of the method here, I'm going to say if config equals null, or config does not equal null, throw new invalid operation exception, server, oops, we need money there, server config.name already registered, and then config equals config. So that'll prevent anyone from trying to invoke this multiple times. We could also do a null check, I guess, if config equals null. Notice that I'm doing a lowercase c here because that's the property. Throw new invalid operation, or this would be argument null exception config, which we want to do use the name of operator, and I'll move this above here. So the final code looks like that, and we're using the name of here to statically type, passing in the name of that. So we now have a way to keep track of the configuration of each one of our region servers on our region server context. Now, we're going to have a couple problems. First of all, I deleted that class. We're going to have to remove references to it. Second of all, we need to actually go about adding our region server queue to our IOC container. Because right now, our game instance system is requesting it in its constructor, but AutoFact doesn't know anything about this class, so we need to make sure to register that. So to do that, of course, our IOC registration happens in our master server context. And as you see, we already have that error here where I deleted that class, so we can nuke that line entirely. And then I'm simply going to replace it with builder register type of region server queue as self, because we're not using interfaces here. Then we want single instance. We want a singleton, so every single time it's requested, we'll get the same type. So it looks like we still have a couple errors, 3 errors in 2 files, so let's just click on that. Don't care, that'll be fixed when we do a build. Our game lobby is wanting a reference to this class, even though it doesn't do anything with it. The game servers, you can see it doesn't do anything with it because ReSharper has colored that gray. The game lobby is going to have a reference, though, to our region server queue. So we simply have to change the name. Region server queue, we need to change it in its field as well as change it in its constructor. So now we have 1 error in 1 file, and that should just be this, our generated code, which is totally fine because that's what happens when we change our interfaces. So let's go ahead and hit F6, and hopefully nothing will blow up. And it did. Buzz MMO base generated. Does not like that. It does not like game server config. Why doesn't it like game server config? So obviously game server config, that didn't get fixed by a refresh. That's unfortunate. So remember, this is the generated proxies that we have, and it doesn't like it. So the namespace isn't being imported properly, which obviously is going to be a problem. So let's go ahead and see how we wrote it up here. We get, ooh, that's interesting. Okay, so I'll tell you exactly what's going on here. Remember how, in order to resolve namespaces, all we do is collect all of the using statements of all of the classes that have interfaces, and we just dump it blindly there, assuming it's going to cover each case. Well, the funny thing is that game instance does not need a fully qualified path to the game server config class because it's located in a namespace above where game server config is located in. And because of that, we don't have a fully qualified name, so we don't have a using statement. Because we don't have a using statement up here, the using statement doesn't get added here, and because a using statement doesn't get added there, it doesn't get added, or it doesn't allow us to access that without being fully qualified. So we have a couple options. We could certainly do up here using buzzmmo server just buzzmmo server. Now, see, the thing about that is ReSharper is going to yell at us about that, because ReSharper is going to detect that using statement is not required. So that's a very unfortunate aspect of how I'll take responsibility for this, how I handled namespaces. There's another potential way to fix this, and that is, we know that the buzzmmo.server, that's the only time we're going to have this specific problem for this particular thing. What we could do is, in our buzzmmo tools, in our generate commands, what we could do is add a new input to our component interface here that allows us to specify and force a particular namespace for being included. And I think we'll do that at a later time. I just want to see this work. So let's just hit F6 again. It should be resolved now that I have this bogus using statement up there. And it is. See, now that I have that bogus using statement up there, in the generated code, it now has the not so bogus, in this particular instance, using statement right there. All right. So now let's see if it works. Well, let me trace the execution first. So go here, go to Systems Master, our game instance system. When we awake, which we created that fiber for some reason. I can't remember why we did that. Oh yeah, we created that fiber for our deferred test. We don't need that anymore. We can delete all that. So when we awake, we do proxy register server, which should be in game instance system, which should do server queue register server, which should in turn finally log the info. So let's see what happens. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to my logs. I'm going to clear them out. So we know that. We know they're clear. And then I'm going to come over here and hit F6 in Visual Studio. Now, it's important. I did make an actual change to the code. So when I hit F6, it will trigger a server restart. If you hit F6 again after not making a change to the code, then it's not going to trigger a restart. Okay, looks like we have some problems. Connected master server, disconnect, connecting master server, disconnect, connected master server, then argument exception. Cannot write game server config. Reason we can't write game server config is because our serializer knows nothing about that class. So to fix it, again, we will write a serializer, it's a binary serializer at one point, but to fix it for now, we go into our game server config class and make it implement the iCustom serializer interface. Remember, the iCustom serializer interface is an interface that's understood by our serialization system. So to save it, we're simply writer write name, writer write, ooh, this is going to be interesting. UDP, actually it's going to be serializer write object writer UDP connection, and then we're going to have to do the same. What are you yelling at? Oh, it wants a binary writer and it wants a type. So type of, I should really make a generic. Don't I have a generic version of this method? Did I really not think ahead to make a generic version of this method? I did not. Okay, so we have to pass in a type of Photon server connection, UDP connection, and then we'll do writer write unique ID. Now, unique ID is a GUID. There's two ways to go about this. We could certainly use our serializer's GUID serialization, or we can simply do unique ID dot 2-byte array. And the 2-byte array is going to make a 16-byte array representing this GUID. So for loading, we simply do name equals reader read string. UDP connection equals cast to Photon server connection serializer read object reader type of Photon server connection. I really wish I had a generic version of that method. And then unique ID equals new GUID. We have to instantiate a GUID, and there is an overload that takes in a byte array. That is very handy. So we'll do reader read bytes. It's important to get this right. Read bytes 16, because there's going to be exactly 16 bytes at that particular location. If you get that wrong, everything's going to blow up. Okay, so now we need to make sure that our Photon server connection also implements iCustom serializer, but I think we already did that. And it does. So, I mean, honestly, instead of passing it into our serializer write object, we could just straight up do UDP connection save writer serializer. We could do that. That cleans up the code a little bit. I think yeah, so then we'll, over here in our load, we'll do UDP connection equals new Photon server connection without parameters. Don't use parameters. And then we'll do UDP connection dot load, passing in our reader and our serializer. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm here up on another monitor clearing out my logs because I'm about to hit F6. All right. Check that out. Game server 1, game server 2, both with unique IDs, have been registered. Okay, so I think in the next video, we'll talk more about our server queue. So remember, in our Buzz server master, our region server queue, we have a way to register it. We now need a way to unregister it. And I can't... There'll be different ways to unregister it. Either the region server itself will notify the master server, hey, I need to be unregistered, clean up gracefully, or there will be a client disconnect, and that means something bad happened on the network, and then we'll unregister it not so gracefully. And with that, we'll see you guys then.